Hey y'all, I'm Ashley. Welcome back to my channel. Today I got something to talk about. We're gonna go back. We're gonna take it way back. So I want to talk about midwifery because research has shown us, research and on a quantitative and qualitative, and I'm talking about research in terms of through actually practicing it and also through scientific, let's have a control group and a non-control group type of science, right? And so midwifery is the answer to our maternal health issues, crisis, etc., disparities, all those things. And so today I want to talk about the history of midwifery, particularly in this country, but it relates to other countries and other cultures outside of the American culture, right? So first of all, what is midwifery? It is the profession of well woman care from fertility, pregnancy, birth, postpartum, right? And so midwives are trained professionals. They are trained in all those different areas or specialties, if you want to call them that. And some even go beyond that. It's to just whole well woman care, right? So they are very skilled in understanding the birth process, understanding the fertility process, and making sure that women are taken care of. The midwifery model of care is really a person-centered care. There's a lot of hands-on, face-to-face, in-depth conversation, understanding, collaborative working, for lack of a better word, when it comes to how a midwife works with a woman. And many times, especially midwives are very flexible, I'll say that in how they work and in what areas they work. So you have midwives that work in hospitals, at birth centers, and at home, in people's homes, right? But across the gamut, the care is way more personalized. So they usually spend a lot more time during appointments. A normal, right, like OB appointment would be maybe 15 minutes, whereas with a midwife, you're spending 45 minutes to an hour, maybe an hour and a half, because she wants to know everything that's going on. She's observing your environment. She's asking you about your family life. She's wondering about how other births went, the whole thing. But as we look back in history, right, midwifery is really understood as the basis for reproductive care, right? Around the world. Even though today in the United States, we don't treat it as such. We treat obstetrics and gynecology as the beginning of reproductive care in this country, and that's simply not true, right? There are ancient texts and artifacts that have record of midwifery and midwives in ancient times, in ancient Egypt, in Greece, in China, in indigenous communities, right? One that comes to the top of my mind is the Bible. Midwives are mentioned in the Bible during Moses' time, right? When Pharaoh was afraid of a new king coming, right? The birth of a new king was coming, and Pharaoh was like, wait a minute, kill all them babies, right? Kill all the Jewish babies. And so he told the midwives to kill the babies, right? And it talks about midwives in the Bible. So that's just one of the very many examples in ancient texts that show or talk about midwifery. And in all of these cultures, midwifery was held as a respected profession, right? These were seen as community leaders. They were seen as healers. They were seen as folks that you go to for advice and understanding, right? When they gave you something or they told you something to do, it was, I'm not going to call it law, but you saw it as very important and it was something that you wanted to follow to the T, right? They were very much respected. Not like in our society today, where many times midwives are seen as practicing pseudo medicine or as not being real professionals, as being unsafe, unclean, all those things. which we'll get into why that is. In some cultures, especially like indigenous cultures, midwives were also held in a high spiritual regard. They were seen as spiritual leaders as well, right? Because we know birth is more than just a physical event. It is also very spiritual, right? There is something happening in the transferring of spirits and energy in a birth space, right? And that's why it's really important to be intentional about who is in your space, because if they're bringing bad energy into your space, it's going to impact the experience of the birth or the birth experience, right? Also, a big part of this, of how midwifery has evolved over the years, or how it went from being so respected to disregarded, right, is through the transatlantic slave trade. So Africans that were stolen and enslaved from Africa, many of them, some of them were midwives, and they held the knowledge and the understanding and the practice of midwifery with them as they came, and they passed it on, right? At this time, especially in other places around the world, and I'll specifically talk about the U.S., birth was dangerous because we didn't know how to work with the process, right? And it was dangerous because of all the other things around that folks didn't understand, right? Things like diseases and stuff, right? The vast movement of people from country to country and introducing different ailments into those places that people's bodies were not used to, and it causing, mass deaths and just tragic situations also really impacted birth, right? And so you had a lot of women that were dying from just the same diseases that folks were normally dying from, but it was more detrimental during the pregnancy and birth phases, postpartum phases of it, right? Also, so the practice of midwifery was passed down. It came through the transatlantic slave trade, right, to the United States, and enslaved women who were midwives passed down that knowledge to their daughters, to their nieces, right, to the women behind them. And these women became known as the granny midwives. Today we call them when we reflect on their work, we call them grand midwives, because they seen the term granny as undermining and disrespectful. So we call them grand midwives. But these women, these healers, these community leaders, they were delivering most of the babies, right? So we're talking before obstetrics was really a thing. We're talking about when gynecology was being developed through torture, but being developed, there were midwives who were attending these births, right? And were coaching women through pregnancy, birth, and postpartum. And not just Black women. They were coaching everybody through it, right? They were attending the births of white women as well. Poor, enslavers, all the things, right? And these women were serving multiple generations of folks, right? They were going to births with their mothers, with their grandmothers at the age of 5, right? There's an account of one midwife who caught her first baby at the age of 5, right? And then she really got into the work when she was in her 40s or 50s. But she was in that space the entire time. She was learning, she was apprenticing, she was helping in that space that entire time. These folks were providing, again, prenatal, labor, postpartum, and newborn care. And they were teaching families how to care for themselves, how to care for the mothers, how to care for these babies, right? They were going in and like helping to prepare the spaces, the homes for a new baby, right? We got to clean this up. We need to move this around. We got to, block this off, all of the things. And when I think about the term gran or granny, I really think about grandma. Like, that's how I think of my grandmother, right? When my mom had children, my grandmother would come. When I had my children, my mother, the grandmother, would come and help set up the space or rearrange the space, would help prepare with all the supplies that were needed, would help make sure that mom had food and that all those things, right? That was what midwives were doing. Like, that was their specialty. And again, they offer emotional, spiritual, and herbal support. As white institutions started to be established and to grow, the expertise of these professionals, of these women, were beginning to be undermined, undervalued, and flat out dismissed. Even though they were practicing safe, their practices were safe, right? There's an account of one midwife who never, actually there's many accounts of midwives who like never lost a child, never lost a mother, never lost a baby. Whereas when obstetrics started to move into hospitals and white male doctors and white female nurses started to take over the practice, there were a lot more deaths. There was a smear campaign that went on as these institutions were growing in order to help them to grow even the more, because at this time, right, the early 1900s, late 1800s, most births were happening at home. And so to move them into hospitals, a smear campaign against midwives happened, where in the newspapers they would talk about them. They would say that they were dirty, that they were unskilled, that they didn't know what they were doing. And they really started to push against midwifery in order to bring it into the hospital. Another thing that they did is they started to institutionalize the practice and regulate the practice with laws, right? So they began to say, okay, midwives, y'all have to come get trained and get a license, right? Even though they were the ones that knew the information, that understood how birth really worked, and the folks who were creating these institutions were actually learning from them, right? And they began to twist some of that information to fit them, to use all of their modern technology and things that in some cases were not necessary, but it was convenient and it made money, right? And it lifted them up as the experts. So these laws started to be passed that they had to become licensed. And so they would have to go and get training and be regulated, and they would have to report their births to them now and say like, this is what happened, these were the outcomes. And then slowly they started to push the midwives out. They stopped offering licensure, and still in some states, depending on the credentials of the midwife, it's not legal to be a midwife in that state. I'm in Maryland. In Maryland, in the last 5 to 10 years is when non-nurse midwives, so midwives who don't have a nursing background, were not legal in the state of Maryland. So just recently, it became legal again for folks who were trained as midwives outside of these formal institutions, were they able to practice. Also, I want to mention, this is somewhat connected to the history of midwifery, but also in another video we'll take a deeper dive into like the history of women's health and women's health care in general, and talk more about gynecology. But I want to say that a lot of the practices that we have now when it comes to gynecology, obstetrics, these things were developed through the torture and experimentation of enslaved women, right? And so they literally would not give them pain medicine. They would cut them open. They would basically dissect these women without their permission, obviously, and without giving them any type of pain medicine to do it. And they developed a lot of these practices. The man whose name I will not mention, the father of gynecology, was the lead in those things, which is why it's so problematic that he's considered the father of gynecology. But just keep that in mind when you think about the state of maternal health and why we are in a maternal health crisis, which is largely because of racism, right? It all builds on each other, and it wasn't that long ago, right? Like, these things were not that long. These were not thousands of years ago. These were maybe 2 centuries ago, right? This were like, they're literally, when I became a birth worker, there was a grand midwife still practicing in Maryland, right? Some of the midwives will explore and other videos, like they were still practicing when I was born. And I'm only 35, right? So this is not old news. This was not so long ago that we are well removed from it that it does not impact us today. It very much impacts what we're seeing today in maternal health. Thank you for joining me. If you want to explore this deeper as a birth worker, please join the membership, the Black Birth Central membership. It's only $20 a month. We're doing monthly movie nights where we're diving into different documentaries, different topics around maternal health, as well as we're starting a midwifery series where we're having live conversations with current midwives, student midwives on the process of becoming a midwife and also what it means to be a midwife and just what their experiences are. So if you want to join us for that, blackbirthcentral.com/join and become a member. And you also get a directory profile where we help match you up with clients in your area. So yes, we'll see you next time. Peace.